Welcome to Workers' Comp Update with Joseph Cinsali. Joe is a partner in the Chase Cinsali Law Group and is also treasurer of the New York Workers' Compensation Alliance, dedicated to serving the needs of injured workers throughout New York State by lobbying their interests in Albany.
We spoke to Joe about the New York State Constitutional Convention and how that can affect the workers' compensation statute in New York. Joe, what is the New York State Constitutional Convention all about?
In the most concise terms, at intervals of every 20 years, whether New York State should hold a constitutional convention, which is colloquially known as a con-con, comes on the ballot. New York voters can vote either yes or no as to whether a constitutional convention should be held. Ultimately, the purpose of the Constitutional Convention is to propose amendments to the state's constitution. The process is rather protracted, as first delegates are selected to attend the convention, and then those delegates then propose such amendments, which then have to be voted on by the voting public.
When will the New York voters actually vote on whether to have a constitutional convention?
The vote is going to take place on Election Day here in New York State, which is November 7th. Interestingly, a recent news article advised that only 58% of the voters in New York State are even aware that such a vote is to take place. The text of the question posed on the ballot reads as follows. It says, should there be a convention to revise the Constitution and amend the same? That's the actual text of the question that voters can either vote yes or no to. While I'm of the opinion that the text of the question is less than desirable, meaning it's not presented in the best language, which would identify specifically what the whole point of the Constitutional Convention is. Something as simple as omitting the words New York right before the term Constitution may lead an uninformed voter to think that perhaps they're voting on a constitutional convention involving the more familiar federal constitution as opposed to the state constitution, which New York would not be the vehicle to do that. But the vagaries of that question result in perhaps the voter not knowing exactly what they would be voting for. But the vote will occur on November 7th. So I think that education about what the vote is and exactly the mechanism by which you would vote for that Constitutional Convention should be brought to the public's attention.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now tell me, who and what can be affected by actually having a Constitutional Convention?
I'm of the opinion that a Constitutional Convention is akin, and this is the phrase that I use all the time when explaining this, is akin to giving a teenager the keys to a Ferrari. Any part of the text of the state constitution is vulnerable to alteration by any special interest group, and it's unfettered by any check. So if there is a constitutional convention, the text of the actual document, proponents of a constitutional convention or any special interest can run wild, run amok with what they want to change in terms of the founding document of the state. Although the proposed amendments would ultimately be subject to voter approval, just like the question on the ballot, perhaps the amendments could be crafted in such a manner as to veil the very serious modifications that would be contained in whatever proposed amendments are put forward. So it's important to maintain throughout the whole process a level of education so that you understand, the voter understands exactly what they're getting themselves into by doing that. For instance, any person receiving or anticipates receiving a New York State pension should be on heightened alert with respect to this. As of March of this year, there's $192 billion residing in the New York State Pension Fund. These funds were designed for pension recipients. They is part of whatever employment negotiation they entered into. The Constitutional Convention is the vehicle by which those interested in diverting the funds out of the pension system to some other purpose would be through modification of the text of the state constitution. So if anybody is anticipates receiving a pension or is a pension recipient, this has a constitutional convention can have dire circumstances for affecting them. There are various other groups that are of the opinion the convention will allow for alterations to the Constitution that are favorable However, those proponents of the Constitutional Convention have to realize the risk involved in allowing unfettered alteration of the state's founding document. The risk of radical changes far outweighs the benefit that would come from that. The Constitutional Convention proponents should rely on the current mechanism to change the laws in the state. That's through the legislative process, and not attempt to change the text of the controlling document in the state. That's the opinion that my like-minded colleagues believe. There's a couple of myths that have developed around the Constitutional Convention, and I'd like to dispel those immediately. There's some urban legends that have evolved. The first is that the actual ballot, the form that's used for the vote, has the question of whether a constitutional convention should be held, as I discussed before, the actual text of it, on the reverse of the ballot. So it's not on the surface. We use Scantron ballots, for lack of a better term, here in New York. And this question is on the reverse side of what would be deemed the front of it. A voter would have to turn the ballot over to answer the question. So if you do want to answer definitively no, you would turn the ballot over and indicate that in the little circle that is next to the word no. The second myth I want to dispel is that there's been some talk about if you omit an answer to the question, in other words, you just don't answer yes or no, that it counts as a vote in favor of having a constitutional convention. That's not the case. My office had verified with the New York State Board of Elections that an omitted answer, that is not yes and not no, simply won't be counted one way or the other. So will not count as a yes vote if you leave it blank. However, I think if you're a proponent against, as I am, having a constitutional convention, any voter should indicate no clearly so that a no vote is counted, and that having a sufficient amount of no votes will send the right message that this is not a mechanism that the voting public here in New York would want to get involved with.
Joe, since our last podcast, has anything happened with respect to the revisions to regulations and guidelines proposed by the New York State Workers' Compensation Board?
Yes, Steve, as you know, I'm the treasurer of the New York Workers' Compensation Alliance, which is the political action committee that represents the interest of injured workers in Albany, the state capital. Myself and several colleagues attended the hearing that was held with respect to the proposed revisions before the state assembly. There were members of the state assembly that were there where those members listened to and considered testimony from various different stakeholders that would be affected by any proposed changes in the regulation or the guidelines. The chair of our organization, a gentleman by the name of Robert Gray, offered his testimony in response to that which was given by the representatives from the Workers' Compensation Board itself. The testimony of the Workers' Compensation Board was abysmal at best, in my opinion, and unsatisfactory on several different levels. If anybody wanted to view the video transcript of the hearing, it's available online. But the highlights include the Workers' Compensation Board's position that the original proposed revisions that were developed by the Compensation Board years prior to the mandate which authorized them to revise the guidelines, they deemed it somehow irrelevant, that document. And they were reticent to release that document for consideration by the other stakeholders. Why they would deem that's irrelevant is beyond me, simply because we get to see what the motivation perhaps is behind the proposed revisions that were in that document and why they may have led to the revisions that are in the document that was indeed released for consideration. Also, no viable explanation of how the proposed change to the regulation, which would eliminate an injured worker from securing medical evidence without any restriction, is somehow in line with the direction for the Workers' Compensation Board to produce revisions to the guidelines and to the regulations that would reflect improvement in medical technology and result in a reflection of better medical outcomes. The regulation, as altered, would have no impact, has no correlation rather whatsoever with respect to an injured worker obtaining his or her own medical evidence and then an improved medical outcome. There's just no correlation there whatsoever. Indeed, Steve, no viable explanation was proffered as to how the content of the proposed revisions actually reflect an improvement in medical technology or a better medical outcome from a course of treatment. One resonating highlight to Mr. Gray's testimony was his visual display on how normal range of motion was arbitrarily changed by the Workers' Compensation Board in the proposed revisions, which essentially eliminates what was previously considered a defect and now converts that defect to a normal value because they've changed arbitrarily what normal range of motion is. And that's not representative of advances in medicine. It would be representative of a change ultimately in the human genome, which hasn't happened since human beings first came on the scene. So again, another non sequitur. Also, and a very glaring one is a highlight of omission. The head of the New York Business Council, who was the proponent of the draconian proposed changes, was nowhere to be found when the time for his testimony came during the hearing. He was called, didn't respond. The hearing took place during what's known as the comment period, meaning that comments may be submitted in response to the proposed revisions. And I'm glad that the hearing was held during that period, because now we can consider the testimony or the lack thereof. Like I just said, the representative from the Business Council, who's the major proponent of these guidelines, did not avail himself for any kind of cross-examination by the assembly members. We can incorporate that testimony or lack thereof, like I said, into any kind of commentary that's submitted to the Workers' Compensation Board.
Let me ask you this, Joe. When will the period for parties to submit comments on the proposed changes come to an end?
Steve, the comments have to be submitted to the Workers' Compensation Board here in New York by October 23rd to satisfy the current content period.
What will happen after the close of the comment period?
After the comment period closes, the Workers' Compensation Board will have an opportunity to review the comments that were submitted, and then, if they so choose, revise the revisions if the board deems it appropriate. After what is tantamount to a pretty exposing legislative hearing, I cannot see how the Workers' Compensation Board does not in some way come up with another version of these proposed changes and revisions. But stranger things have happened, and the board may not elect to change anything and continue to submit the proposal that was set forth previously. There will be another 30-day comment period subsequent to the issuance of any new revisions. It's important to remember that the legislative mandate gives until December 31st of this year for the new regulations and guidelines to be fostered, as the current guidelines and regulations will no longer be effective as of January 1, 2018. And when I say regulations and guidelines, I'm specifically talking about obtaining medical evidence of permanency, and specifically what's known as scheduled loss of use, as we've had prior podcasts that discuss that. But the next podcast that I'll deliver will bring people up to speed as to what's going on as a result of the comments that have been submitted to the Workers' Compensation Board.
Joe, one final question. How can the Constitutional Convention affect the Workers' Compensation Statute in New York?
The Constitutional Convention can foster amendments to the founding document of the state, and that can supersede any of the legislation that currently exists. So if somebody, or a proponent rather, of any kind of changes were to be successful in proposing an amendment to the state constitution, which could either decimate or even eliminate the Workers' Compensation Statute as we know it here in New York, it can be done through the Constitutional Convention process rather than going through the legislative process where laws would be made accordingly. And that's actually the proper way to do it, in my opinion. But the Constitutional Convention could result in amendments being proposed that could eliminate, and it's not just workers' compensation, it's any other right. It's just fair game for any party to try to alter the text of the founding document. So in sum, Steve, I can't see the benefit of a state constitutional convention. So I know my constituents and myself, when I say constituents, I mean clients that I have and colleagues, were in favor of not having a constitutional convention because the risks that to any of the rights that we've come to know and appreciate is far too great. So we're encouraging people to vote no to this. this question that's going to be on the ballot on November 7th.
Thanks for listening to Workers' Comp Update with Joseph Sensali. Joe is a partner in the Chase and Sally Law Group and is also treasurer of the New York Workers' Compensation Alliance. Join us next time as Joe keeps us updated with what's going on in Albany.